can't undo it. You can't undo that vote. That vote happened. It will have always have happened. Whatever they do, it cannot be changed.
It energised people. It brought people back into politics. It was a moment in which the public intruded on history. So, referendum night, I, like everyone else, was watching bated breath.
I was watching it at home actually. I'd been at work during the day and got home quite late.
I went up to Manchester for the results.
So actually I was at home, just watching the results roll in.
And I was in Brussels, and we went for a drink. We were there with lots of officials and diplomats. They were all Remain, of course, and they were being so patronising.
When the polls closed, my gut instinct was that Remain had won the referendum, just.
In the days and weeks going up to it, I think it's fair to say that the consensus was it was going to be for Remain.
Although I had spoken to people active in the Leave campaign like me, they'd been knocking on doors in predominantly working class areas.
For me it was just like, no, I'm not going to believe that poll, because like, being out on that doorstep, you really get a sense of how they're feeling and actually how they go out and vote.
The vote for Leave amongst those people was just overwhelming, and in some cases people said to me literally they couldn't find a single person who voted Remain.
Good evening and welcome at the end of this momentous day when each one of us...
So the coverage begins, 10 p.m, and the results start to come in. Newcastle was the first one, and it's a vote for Remain, but it's very narrow, much more narrow than the pollsters thought it would be.
Once we had the 10 o'clock turnout figures, and there were over 70%, I thought we had a realistic chance of winning.
And then following on from that, just after midnight, you had the Sunderland result, and it was a huge swing for Leave.
But it was still within the scenarios of a narrow Remain victory. But it was BBC's coverage. Nick Robinson was on, and he said, I keep bumping into people who haven't voted since 1983.
And that was kind of the starting point. And then when a couple of hours later towards the end, when Bradford came in, which is just next door where I used to live, as a Leave vote, I was absolutely shocked.
Just throughout the night, constituency after constituency, in all these kind of forgotten places in the north, in Wales, were standing up and voting for Leave. Suddenly people started to get very worried.
I stopped buying the round of drinks. I went into one of the press centres and I started working, and I worked through the night.
You know, then it became clear that Leave was going to win it.
And it was going to be a major overturning of the current political order in Britain.
So it was a pleasant evening.
We can now say the decision taken in 1975 by this country to join the common market has been reversed by this referendum to leave the EU.
23rd of June was a fantastic day, because I think it was a genuine democratic revolt in this country, the like of which we haven't seen for a long, long time.
I was incredibly excited, and I think the reason why I was so excited was because the whole referendum was set up in such a way that the government thought it would get the result it wanted.
You had pretty much the entire establishment lining up, telling working class people not to vote Leave.
All of the leadership of the political class, vast swathes of the media elite, all of big business, the IMF, all of them were there saying vote for Remain, preaching fire and brimstone if it goes the other way.
So I think that working class people realised that they'd suddenly and unexpectedly been handed a weapon to hit back at an establishment which, frankly, had been completely cloth-eared to their concerns over so long.
When you were out on the doorstep and you were talking to ordinary people, there was individuals who were 60, 70, 80-year-olds who were saying, you know what, I've never voted before because it's a rigged system. You just go from Labour to Conservative, Conservative, Labour, and that's it. You don't get a chance to have your voice heard. But with this one, it broke through all of that.
I think in many respects it was a bit like a general strike. We haven't had one since 1926, but in the sense that people knew it would probably create some instability within the country initially, knew there was probably a bit of a risk to them financially in the short term, but thought also that it was the only weapon they had and might ever get in their lifetime to make their political masters sit up and take notice of them.
That 17.4 million people, that largest democratic mandate in British political history, kind of just undermined any claim these people had to really representing us truly.
I can give you even two British newspaper journalists who were crying. They were crying because they'd lost in their whole lives. Their class, their generation, their layer, their caste had never lost, and they'd lost.
For decades, because of the nature of politics, how aloof it is, its technocratic nature embodied most clearly in the EU, wanted to keep politics out of people's hands. This was a moment in which the mass of people, 17.4 million of them, intruded on politics.
So our political class, they literally hid.
On the day after the referendum result, it was just this incredible kind of stillness in Westminster. It was almost like a bomb had gone off, you know. They couldn't find the Prime Minister, they couldn't find the Chancellor who was going to come out and give this speech. And I think what that really spoke to was what a profound thing had happened, but also what a chasm there was between the political class and the people who had just voted.
No one wanted to be a leader, no one wanted to lead it. That's how radical it was. British people took a decision, and the British political class found that decision so intolerable that that weekend they couldn't lead it.
The sort of liberal establishment was horrified that the people could turn their backs on what they recommended them to do, and now they're in a state of denial.
These oiks aren't supposed to know about the EU. They're not supposed to think about it. They're not supposed to argue about it on buses and in pubs, and that really horrifies it. It was theirs, it belonged to them, and now everybody is a bloody expert on it.
Now, I thought that after the referendum there would be a kind of reassessment of opinion. But if anything, the sneering got worse.
You had people like MPs, like David Lammy, calling for Parliament to overturn the vote. This madness has to stop, was what he said. You had people in the House of Lords talking about cooking up schemes whereby they could stop Brexit from happening, forcing it back to the Commons. You had all sections of the elite responding in this incredibly kind of hysterical way. And I think what it showed is what we always suspected about the views that they held about ordinary people.
There was this notion that those who were inclined to vote to leave were sort of the poor, the not very well educated.
These are xenophobes, these are racists, it's unconstitutional, somehow, you know, we've got to get around it, we've got to stop it.
It was incredible. It was like the return of Victorian elitism. People were saying that Leave voters didn't know what they were voting for, that they were somehow kind of brainwashed by Boris Johnson.
Whether or not old people should have been entitled to vote, you know, people, some of whom had gone through a war for this country. You see the silly pie charts doing the rounds on social media suggesting, well, it's not the will of the people because an absolute majority didn't vote Leave. Well, you never get an absolute majority in any election in this country. Does that mean that no government will ever have legitimacy?
And then the lawyers pile in. And so what we've seen is groups of basically wealthy individuals working with law firms to launch various legal challenges to try and stop Brexit from happening, to try and water it down.
It shifts to the judges. It shifts to the judges. And I think, again, you know, it's that moment of when you try to avoid a democratic decision, you run away. When you disavow it and you try and poison it and you question its legitimacy, not least by questioning the barbaric intentions of the voters, you create a political vacuum which will be filled. And it will be filled by other elements of order, of the state. And it happens in this particular phase to be the judiciary.
Take the main legal challenge, the one that's been to the High Court and now the Supreme Court. This is backed by Gina Miller, a kind of cash-stuffed investment manager, as well as a lot of unnamed business interests who we haven't heard much about either. Now, the question on the table is very dry and constitutional. Who has the authority to implement Brexit, to invoke Article 50? The government says that they have it under royal prerogative. Legal challenge claims that it has to go to a vote in Parliament. The reason it's become such a focus is that this isn't about the rule of law. This is about attempt to use the law to frustrate a democratic vote. I mean, they barely even try and hide it. They talk about this is about parliamentary sovereignty, this is about making sure that our processes are followed, but really what they're talking about is trying to use the law and to use Parliament to overturn the vote, to use parliamentary sovereignty against popular sovereignty.
Parliamentary sovereignty is in relation to Parliament and the sovereign. However, Parliament is not sovereign over the will of the people.
Frankly, when you've had millions of people who have voted in a democratic referendum saying, yes, this is what we've decided, this is what we're going to do, then the pressing of that button, the triggering of Article 50, should be a formality. No need really, certainly from a moral point of view, for MPs to have any say on that, because people have already had their say on it. And I think it's a bit bizarre that a Prime Minister can declare war using the royal prerogative without the approval of MPs, but when it comes to giving effect to the will of the people, he's told no, you need MPs to vote on that.
When we have nationwide referenda, we actually go directly to the people, and it's an exercise of direct democracy, and therefore it becomes our duty to implement that will.
And this goes back to the birth of the democratic tradition in this country, where you had, in the midst of the Civil War, a group known as the Levellers, who fought on the side of Parliament against the King, really kind of birthed the idea of democracy as we know it, drafting in 1647 the Agreement of the People, which spelled out not only should everyone be represented, should everyone have a vote, but also to enshrine freedoms, to put limits on Parliament so that it doesn't act against our wishes and act against our liberty. So Parliament is sovereign, but only because the people are sovereign. And if Parliament ever oversteps the mark, if it ever used the power that we lend it to override our wishes, then, in the words of the Levellers, the power should return to whence it came.
When you see an establishment which, to a man and woman, is pretty much lined up against the voter, saying that effectively MPs need to ignore the will of the people and just block Brexit, then you realise actually that battle's never won, and that democracy is a precious thing that can easily be lost.
The arguments against democracy are as old as democracy itself. Every movement to try and spread the franchise, to try and impress the public on politics, has always met exactly these same arguments, just repackaged in a different form. I mean, you only have to look at the Chartists to see that.
So we're here in Kennington Park, which was roughly where there was Kennington Common. Being here is significant because they had their last great mass meeting here in April 1848.
So the Chartists were a movement in particularly the 1830s and the 1840s, were championing the idea that the people weren't pitiable, they weren't ignorant, they should have control over their own lives, the people should be sovereign.
Here you had a whole class of men and women who had the effrontery, the People's Charter, to draw up a very essential democratic constitution.
Demanding the right to vote, the right to a secret ballot, the right to be able to stand as MPs. They addressed mass meetings across the country, started an industry of newspapers, and delivered 3 separate petitions to Parliament, each of them bearing millions of signatures, some of which turned out to be fake, but nevertheless millions of signatures.
They mobilised a whole section of the population had never been involved in politics before, had always been kept well pushed out by the sort of magistrate ruling class, and they changed Britain. I mean, regardless of actually whether they won or not, they started the debate inexorably towards extension of the suffrage.
And what's striking is that the response to them is so similar to what we saw in the wake of the Brexit vote. One MP, when they were debating the second Chartist petition, which was delivered in 1842, said that giving ordinary people the vote was, in his words, giving them the liberty to destroy themselves, which certainly reminds me of this idea of we didn't know what we were voting for. And there was also this idea that if you allow, again, poor, uneducated people to have a say in politics, they're just going to be exploited by people who in those days were referred to as professional agitators. The arguments against democracy have always been the same. And the only thing that's different today is racism has been thrown into the mix. That's about it.
And we should try and think what it is that they don't like. And what it is that they don't like is the intrusion into politics of the public, and the real public, not the people who live in a public safe space in, Hoxton or some trendy bit of East Berlin. And they're trying to shape politics so it's shaped around their lives and their interests, which are rooted in their communities, in the patterns of how they live their lives, of how a lot of people's hopes have been stifled and sometimes even snuffed out during the course of the last 20 or 30 years, and the political class don't like it.
So there's this idea that the Brexit vote is about Britain turning in on itself, which is just fundamentally not true. I think the Brexit vote was a blow for internationalism, real internationalism, which means the self-determination of all people, no matter where they are, in Europe or across the world.
Democracy is about people who live in a community and their desire to be in control of that, their desire to have citizenship. And what we've seen with the EU, and the EU is an embodiment of, is an attempt to estrange law and government from that level, to put it above them, supranational. And it's not surprising that people want to bring it back home, if you like. They want institutions that represent their own people. And I think to imply that some kind of like racialist nationalism is deeply offensive.
You know, even people on the right of the Tory party, whom I disagree with pretty bitterly, even those people were saying, look, it's about being not just locked into this EU club, it's about being a global player.
A Britain that looks to everyone across the world in the same light and says, you know what, we can trade with everyone, we can help everyone.
Claiming that it's about xenophobia, claiming that it's just about immigration is an attempt to demonise Leave voters and to try and claim the moral high ground, which is a bit rich, considering the fact that the European Union practices a pretty openly racist immigration policy, that to the tune of €1 billion a year it pays African dictators to keep black and brown people out of Europe.
I think that British people have done something that deserves applause, and if others follow us in Europe, that can't be a bad thing.
If there was one message of modern European history, it's the demand from the people for more control. And so Brexit is not just an opportunity for Britain, it's an opportunity for people across Europe.
There is a European upsurge in angry, disenchanted voters who have had enough with institutions that don't respond to democracy. And I think that rebellion, if anything, is more acute in lots of European countries.
I think that people like that in Greece and others are probably thinking, well, this edifice can crumble. You know, this institution which we thought was almighty and all-powerful is now in a fight for its own survival.
The Brexit vote is very much the first big moment in a new phase of European political history where voters will not accept the idea that the political order has to be unrepresentative for the good of civilization.
It should, you would hope, be a shot in the arm for democracy.
The challenge for us now is to say, what do we think is the right policy for us? We have got to take greater responsibility. We can no longer go on and blame Brussels, which sometimes has been convenient for politicians, but I think that's a good thing.
You've got to then go back to the people, because we hold the power. If it wasn't for us, they wouldn't be there in the first place.
You can kick out the Tories at the ballot box and elect a better government. You never get the opportunity to kick out the EU Commission.
The fact that democracy was struggled for such a long period of time makes this moment so important.
It's brought the question of democracy, the question of the people, right back to the fore. The great unresolved question of our times is who the people are and what control they should have.
Now is the time for all people in Britain to really hold on to the virtue of what has happened. People have taken a decision, that decision has to be implemented. The culture of people talking about it, the fact that now everybody is an expert, everybody's thinking about that.
And I think now our job is to deepen that, is to expand it and bring everyone in on deciding the future of politics.
We as ordinary people have got power when we choose to exercise it, and that's the wonderful thing about democracy. We should have more of it.